with, I think, starts the class off for me relatively easy. Though this one's not the cleanest at the base of his chest and not the most elevated through his front 1/3, I think when you put your hands on this guy, he is all there, and he's one that you really have to appreciate. By far the boldest and the most opened up through the center upper portion of his rib cage. He's the biggest out of his rack, extremely fresh to the touch, really squared up and really nice in terms of his loin edge. And when I study him coming out of his hip, he's extremely square, extremely powerful out of his dock and through his pin setting. It drops simply the most shape for the center and lower portion of his leg. He doesn't balance up too bad for you when you study him on the side. Like I said, no, he's not the best in terms of his chest form, but he still balances up extremely well. And when you put this guy into motion, he keeps himself together pretty well on the move for me as well. Just a really nice one to go ahead and start the class off with. The one that I have coming out in a second, I think by far is the most attractive sheep that we have in this class. Extremely elevated through his chest form, really long and extended through his front 1/3, and his neck ties in extremely high on the point of his shoulder. He's strong and level down his top line, extremely long and level out of his hip. You appreciate the foot size, you appreciate the bone size that he has up underneath. Now for me, he runs out of gas when you compare him back to the one that stands ahead of him today. He gets a little flatter in terms of his rib cage, maybe not quite as dynamic down the top side of his skeleton. But when I study him from behind, he wants to narrow up through his dock and through his pin setting, and maybe doesn't show us just quite the mass and the muscularity through the center and lower portion of his leg that we like to see. We can power him up and open him up in his chest floor just a notch to go along with that balanced look. Certainly one that we can justify possibly moving up the spot. The one that we have coming in third, certainly one that's a little earlier in terms of a maturity pattern. You've certainly given up a little bit of performance to the two that stand ahead of her. But I think this is one that certainly has a lot of good to it. You run your hand down over her rack and out of her loin edge, extremely fresh to the touch, extremely bold and opened up down the top side of her skeleton. She's really stout and powerful as you study her coming out of her hip. Now it's when I study her from the side and get her into motion that she limits herself to the third hold. Standing like she is right there, she gets a little lower in the neck set, she gets a little deeper at the base of her chest. She's a little bit excessive to the set to her hock, and when you put her into motion, she wants to kind of get up underneath herself and set her rear leg a little farther up underneath herself than what I would consider ideal. And she's one that you'd still like to stouten up in terms of her foot and bone work to match her up and give her a little more competitiveness with the two that stand ahead of her, but still one that you have to appreciate for her sheer mass and muscularity. One that we have coming in fourth, one that balances up pretty well for us today, still good enough in terms of her chest form, really parallel in terms of her lines. It's when I put my hands on this one, she studies a little bit plainer and handles plainer over her rack. She gets a little rounder in terms of her loin edges, maybe just a nickel staler to the touch today compared to the three that stand ahead of her. When I study this one from behind, she's maybe giving up just a little bit of shape in the center lower portion of the leg to the three that stand ahead of her. I'd really like to open this one up in terms of her pin setting. I'd really like to see a lot more shape through the center and lower portion of her leg, and maybe even stouten this one up in terms of her foot size to make her a little more competitive. It's still a nice sheep that I think we freshen this one up. We cut her just a little bit closer in terms of her shear job. I think one that's going to do really well for you down the road at your intended show. Next one we have coming up, kind of the same song, second verse. One that I really like the rack shape that this one gives us. It's relatively square, relatively cracked open through the center portion of his rib cage. And when you study this one from behind, his leg really doesn't disappoint you. He's opened up in terms of his pin setting. He shows us plenty of shape. When I study this guy from the side, however, I'd really like to elevate him more through his chest form. I'd really like to level him out of his dock. I'd like to see him connect just a nickel better at his hip-loin junction, and maybe even take that back leg and pull it out of him just a little bit more and set it down with just a little bit more security and authority when we get this guy on the move. I think as this one goes along and he gets a little bit more maturity to him, I think he's going to get just a little bit better. He's one, again, that we like to open up in terms, square him up in terms of his dock, level him off at his hip, and maybe change him up from a balance aspect to move him up any higher. The one that we have coming out next, another one that, in terms of the shape and the dimension that this one shows us over a rack is pretty impressive. It's when I study this one from a latched rib back, that limits her to where she is. She's extremely round and extremely plain in terms of her loin edge. I'm really not a big fan of how she looks up right there at her hip-loin junction. She wants to get just a nickel rounder in terms of her hip. Still maybe like to square her up out of her hip in comparison to the ones that stand ahead of her. But when you study this one from behind, she's one that certainly is dragging behind her a lot of power and a lot of shape through the center portion and down through her stifle. maybe she'd like to change her up from her last rib back to move her any higher. She's also given up just a little bit of performance to the ones that stand ahead of her as well. But still a nice sheep, but again, as this one gets a little more mature, as this one gets a little farther along in her feeding phase, I think this one's just going to get better and better. The one that we round the class off with, to me, is just giving up a little bit too much shape, too much dimension, too much muscularity to the ones that preceded in class. I'd maybe like to take this one's neck and tie it a little higher at the point of his shoulder. I'd like to pick this one up. Pick this one up right behind his shoulder. Maybe wants to break just a notch, especially when we get it into motion. This one gets a little frailer in terms of her foot and bone size. But with a little bit more time and a little bit more feed, again, this one gets a little farther along in its feeding phase, gets a little bit more maturity, gets a little bit more condition on it. I think one that we can definitely justify moving up in the class. Really nice set of lightweight medium wolves. Let's give them a round of applause.